Hello, incurable romantics. Prepare to travel back in time to an era of jazz, secrets, and a love that defied all expectations. The rain fell on Chicago in relentless, silvery sheets, blurring the gaslights into watercolor streaks on the slick black asphalt. For Beatrice Astor, the drumming on the roof of her father's Ford Model T was a maddening metronome, counting down the seconds of her isolation. One moment, she had been fleeing the suffocating perfume and brittle laughter of another society fundraiser. The next, a violent shudder from the engine had plunged her into a world of hostile silence, broken only by the storm. She was stranded, not in the manicured safety of Lincoln Park or the Gold Coast, but in a labyrinth of brick tenements and shadowed alleyways where the city's underbelly breathed smoke and secrets. This was the part of town her father, the Honorable Judge Walter Astor, spoke of with righteous fury, a place of squalor, vice, and men with no good intentions. Beatrice clutched the beaded strap of her purse, her knuckles white. The silk of her celadon green dress, a daring flapper style that fell just below the knee, suddenly felt flimsy, like inadequate armor. Her cloche hat, pulled low over her shingled bob, couldn't hide the fear that pricked at her skin. She was a canary in a coal mine, and the air was growing thin. She tried the ignition again. A groan, a sputter, then nothing. Desperation began its cold creep up her spine. The laughter from the party now seemed a world away, a distant echo from a life of gilded cages and polite conversations. Out here the rules were different. She knew it instinctively. A shape detached itself from the deep shadows of a warehouse doorway across the street. It moved with a slow, deliberate confidence that was more unnerving than a sudden rush. It was a man, his frame broad under a simple woolen coat, a flat cap pulled low over his brow, obscuring his face. He crossed the street, his heavy work boots splashing in the growing puddles, each step echoing her own frantic heartbeat. Panic seized her. This was it. This was the kind of man her father warned her about. A ruffian, a thug, drawn to her like a moth to a doomed flame. She quickly locked the flimsy door, a useless gesture that offered no real security. He stopped beside her driver-side window, and for a long moment simply stood there, letting the rain drip from the brim of his cap. Beatrice held her breath, refusing to look at him, staring straight ahead at the rain-lashed windscreen. A soft, polite rap on the glass made her jump. Reluctantly, her gaze flickered to the side. She could only see his silhouette, but it was enough to confirm her prejudices. He was large, imposing, smelling of wet wool and something faintly metallic, like iron or machinery. She lowered the window a fraction of an inch, the cold, damp air rushing in. Yes, her voice was crisp, laced with the unshakable authority of her social standing. It was the voice she used with tradesmen and servants. "Car trouble, ma'am." His voice was low, a rough baritone that seemed to vibrate with the city's own raw energy. It held no discernible threat, only a calm curiosity. "It would appear so," she clipped, her chin held high. "The engine has stalled. Mind if I take a look? Weather's not fit for a lady to be stranded." Her mind raced. Allowing this stranger under the bonnet of her car felt like an invitation to disaster. But what choice did she have? The streets were deserted, and a long night shivering in a dead automobile was an equally grim prospect. "Do you even know anything about engines?" The question was sharper than she intended, a naked display of her distrust. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a fleeting curve in the shadows. He didn't answer her question directly. Instead, he simply said, "Pop the hood." His calm dismissal of her challenge irked her. With a sigh of frustrated resignation, she reached down and pulled the latch. The man moved to the front of the car, his movements economical and sure. He lifted the heavy hood, propped it open, and leaned in, disappearing from her view. Beatrice watched his back, the muscles shifting under his worn coat as he worked. She could hear the faint clink of metal, a soft curse carried on the wind, the squeak of a loosened belt. Her fear warbled into a different kind of anxiety. He was helping her, yet she felt no gratitude, only a deepening sense of unease. His hands, she'd noticed when he rapped on the window, were not the hands of a gentleman. They were calloused and strong, with dirt etched into the lines of his knuckles. They were the hands of a man who worked or fought for a living. She imagined him emerging from the engine, wrench in hand, demanding far more than a simple thank you. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, he slammed the hood shut, the sound making her flinch. He walked back to her window, wiping his hands on a rag he'd produced from a pocket. Rain slicked his dark hair where it escaped his cap, and in the dim light, she saw his face more clearly for the first time. He was younger than she'd thought, perhaps not yet 30. His features were strong, almost harsh, a square jaw, a straight nose, and eyes so dark they seemed to drink the light. They were startlingly intelligent eyes, observant and piercing, and they were fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin tingle. A faint scar cut through his left eyebrow, a pale white line that spoke of a past she could only imagine in violent, lurid detail. "Should start now," he said, his voice as steady as before. "The belt to your fan was loose, slipped right off, just needed tightening." Beatrice stared at him, momentarily stunned by the simple, technical explanation. "Oh, I see." She reached for her purse, her fingers fumbling with the clasp. This was the transactional part of the encounter, the part she understood. He had performed a menial service. He would be paid a menial wage. It restored the familiar order of her world. She pulled out a small bill, $1. A generous sum, she thought, for a few minutes of work from a man of his station. She pushed it through the narrow gap in the window. "Here, for your trouble." The man looked from the money to her face, and for the first time, his expression was utterly unreadable. The faint smile returned, but it was different now. It was knowing. It held a private amusement that for some reason felt more insulting than any open mockery. He took the bill, his calloused fingers brushing hers. The brief contact was like a spark of electricity, and she snatched her hand back as if burned. "My pleasure, ma'am," he said, the words smooth, yet edged with an irony she couldn't quite place. He tipped his cap, a gesture of deference that felt like a performance. Then, without another word, he turned and melted back into the shadows from which he had come. Her heart was still pounding. She turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, its familiar, reassuring rumble filling the small cabin. Relief washed over her, so potent it almost made her dizzy. She didn't waste a second. Shifting the car into gear, she pulled away from the curb, her tires hissing on the wet pavement. In the rearview mirror, she caught one last glimpse of the empty street corner. He was gone. It was as if he had been a figment of the storm itself. She drove on, the grand stone buildings of her own neighborhood rising to greet her like old friends. But the feeling of safety was tainted. She tried to dismiss the encounter, to file the man away as a common laborer, a low-life thug she had been lucky to escape. Yet she couldn't shake the image of his eyes, dark and knowing, or the unsettling amusement in his smile as he took her $1. He hadn't been grateful or subservient. He had been entertained. Beatrice Astor, daughter of the most powerful judge in Chicago, sped home through the rainy night, completely unaware that she had just offered a pittance to Arthur Romano, the man who owned the very streets she feared, the man who held the city's heart in his capable, calloused hands. And he, in turn, was left with the memory of a defiant, terrified girl, with eyes the color of a stormy sky, a girl who had looked at him and seen nothing at all. It was, he thought, the most interesting thing that had happened to him all week. The days that followed were a return to suffocating normalcy. Beatrice moved through a world of luncheons, charity committee meetings, and endless fittings for dresses she felt no desire to wear. The incident in the rain-slick street felt like a fever dream, a strange and unsettling tear in the polished fabric of her existence. Yet it lingered. In quiet moments, she would find her mind drifting back to the stranger's dark, intelligent eyes and the faint, white scar that bespoke a life utterly alien to her own. She told no one, of course. To admit she had been stranded in such a neighborhood, let alone rescued by a man of that caliber, would have invited lectures from her father and fainting spells from her mother. Tonight, she was performing her duty as the fiancée, in all but name, to Stanley Hayes. Stanley was the human embodiment of a sound investment, stable, predictable, and from an impeccable lineage of bankers. He was handsome in a soft, manicured way, with blonde hair always perfectly parted, and a smile that never quite reached his pale blue eyes. He bored Beatrice to tears. "You look exquisite, my dear," Stanley said, his hand resting proprietarily on the small of her back as they entered. The midnight velvet, that beaded number must have cost father a pretty penny. Beatrice forced a smile, the weight of his hand a familiar, unwelcome pressure. Her dress was a sheath of midnight blue silk, covered in a shimmering constellation of silver beads that chimed softly with every step. It was the height of fashion, a symbol of her status, and felt as much a costume as anything on a theater stage. The midnight velvet was the city's beating heart after dark. Officially a private music club, it was Chicago's most glamorous and notorious speakeasy. The air was thick with a heady mix of French perfume, illegal Cuban cigar smoke, and the intoxicating scent of rebellion. A 7-piece jazz band was on stage, the mournful cry of a saxophone weaving through the sophisticated chatter and the clinking of teacups that everyone knew held more gin than tea. Art Deco lamps cast a golden conspiratorial glow over the room, where politicians rubbed shoulders with heiresses and movie stars whispered with men whose names were only ever printed in the crime pages of the Tribune. Stanley guided her to a prime table near the stage. "Only the best for you, Beatrice." He was proud of his ability to secure a reservation here. It was a testament to the Hayes family's influence. Beatrice murmured her thanks, her eyes sweeping the room. She felt the familiar pang of being an observer in her own life, a beautifully dressed doll placed in a scene for others to admire. She watched the flappers on the dance floor, their movements free and joyful, and felt a yearning for a life less scripted. And then she felt it, a gaze. It was a tangible thing, a sudden, focused intensity that cut through the haze and noise of the club. It made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. She scanned the crowded room, her eyes flitting from face to face, until they landed on a man standing near the grand mahogany bar at the far end of the room. He was leaning back slightly, one hand in the pocket of his trousers, observing the scene with the quiet, assessing air of a king surveying his court. He wore a tuxedo, tailored to perfection, that made his broad shoulders seem even more formidable. His dark hair was slicked back, gleaming under the ambient light. He held a low ball glass, swirling the amber liquid within. There was no flat cap, no worn woolen coat, no grease staining his hands, but there was the same stillness, the same aura of coiled strength, and there was the scar, a faint silver slash through his left eyebrow. Beatrice's breath hitched in her throat. Her blood ran cold, then hot. It was him, the man from the rainy street, the thug, the ruffian, here in the most exclusive club in Chicago, looking as if he owned the very ground it was built upon. He wasn't a patron. He was the power at the center of the room, the deference she saw in the way the bartenders moved around him, the respectful, almost fearful nods he received from passing men in expensive suits. It all clicked into place with a horrifying, exhilarating clarity. her meticulously ordered world tilted on its axis. The labels she had so confidently applied to him, lowlife, commoner, brute, crumbled to dust. As if sensing her recognition, his dark eyes met hers across the room. There was no surprise in them, only that same unnerving, knowing amusement she remembered so vividly. He gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod before turning his attention back to the man he was speaking with. Beatrice's heart hammered against her ribs. She felt a blush of profound shame creep up her neck. She had treated him like dirt beneath her heel. She had handed him $1, a single insulting dollar. "Beatrice, are you quite well?" Stanley's voice broke through her trance. "You look as though you've seen a ghost." I'm fine," she stammered, reaching for her water glass, her hand trembling slightly. "Just a bit warm in here." But the man was already moving. He extricated himself from his conversation with a quiet word and began to make his way through the maze of tables directly toward them. His progress was unhurried, yet it parted the crowd like the bow of a ship through water. People made way for him instinctively. Beatrice wanted to vanish. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole. He stopped at their table, a towering, silent presence. Stanley looked up, his expression a mixture of confusion and annoyance at the interruption. "Mr. Hayes," the man said, his voice the same low baritone, but now stripped of its working-class grit, smoothed into a polished, dangerous purr. He acknowledged Stanley with a brief nod before his gaze settled fully on Beatrice. It was like being pinned by a spotlight. "Do we know you?" Stanley asked, his tone haughty. A faint smile played on the man's lips. "I am Arthur Romano. This is my establishment." Stanley's jaw tightened. The name Romano was whispered in Chicago, never shouted. It was a name associated with power, with the illicit liquor trade, with a shadowy empire that the law couldn't seem to touch. Stanley, the banker, knew exactly who this was. His posture changed instantly, from arrogant to cautiously deferential. "Mr. Romano, of course." "An honor," Stanley managed, rising slightly from his seat. "My apologies. This is my companion, Miss Beatrice Astor." "Miss Astor and I have met," Arthur said softly, his eyes never leaving hers. He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket. For a terrifying second, Beatrice imagined a weapon. Instead, he produced a single, neatly folded dollar bill. He placed it on the white linen tablecloth beside her plate. "I believe this is yours," he said, his voice quiet, for her ears only. "A man should always be paid fairly for his labor, but I couldn't possibly accept your charity." Mortification washed over her in a suffocating wave. The single bill on the pristine white cloth was a screaming indictment of her prejudice, her ignorance, her snobbery. It was the most profound and humiliating rebuke she had ever received, delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. She couldn't speak. She could only stare at him, her cheeks burning, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and shame. It was everything she had been taught to fear, yet he stood before her with more grace and command than any man she had ever known. "I trust you are enjoying the music, Miss Astor," he continued, his tone shifting to that of a perfect host. "I had the band flown in from New Orleans myself." He paused, letting the statement hang in the air, a casual display of his wealth and reach. "Please, enjoy your evening." With another small nod, he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the sophisticated throng, leaving a deafening silence in his wake. "Good heavens," Stanley breathed, staring at the dollar bill as if it were a venomous snake. "What on earth was that about? How do you know a man like Arthur Romano?" Beatrice couldn't answer. She was looking at the dollar, but she was seeing his hands, not greasy and dirty as they had been under the hood of her car, but clean, powerful, and impeccably manicured. The hands of a man who could build an empire or crush an enemy with equal ease. She had made a monumental mistake. She had looked at a lion and seen a stray dog, and now the lion knew her name. The veil had been ripped away, not just from him, but from her own sheltered, prejudiced world. And for the first time in her life, Beatrice Astor felt an undeniable, terrifying thrill. The dollar bill sat on Beatrice's vanity for 3 days, a silent, folded accusation. Every time she looked at it, the memory of Arthur Romano's cool, amused eyes sent a fresh wave of shame through her. Stanley had pestered her with questions, his mind unable to reconcile the pristine Miss Astor with a figure like Romano. She had deflected his inquiries with a vague story about a misunderstanding, a story Stanley accepted only because the alternative was unthinkable. Her life, once a predictable, placid river, now felt turbulent, its currents stirred by an encounter that refused to fade. She found herself scanning newspaper headlines, not for society gossip, but for whispers of the city's gangland activities, searching for his name, both dreading and hoping to find it. Arthur Romano had become an enigma, a puzzle she felt a desperate, illogical need to solve. He represented everything her world was not: dangerous, authentic, and unapologetically alive. On the 4th day, a messenger arrived. Not the usual postal worker, but a young man in a crisp driver's uniform who handed a single, heavy cream envelope to the Astor family's butler. It was addressed simply to Miss Beatrice Astor, in a bold, decisive hand. Her heart leaped into her throat as she took it to the privacy of her room. The paper was thick, expensive. There was no return address. With trembling fingers, she broke the wax, sealed a simple, unadorned I, and unfolded the note. Miss Astor, I have acquired a new singer for the club, a talent I believe you would appreciate. She will be performing privately this Friday the evening, after hours. I would be honored if you would be my guest. A car will wait for you at the corner of your street at 11 o'clock. It was not a request. It was a summons. It was audacious, reckless, and utterly thrilling. Every ounce of her upbringing, every lesson on propriety and social station, screamed at her to burn the note and forget it ever existed. Her father, the judge, would be apoplectic. Stanley would be scandalized. The society matrons would whisper her name into ruin over their afternoon tea. And yet, she couldn't refuse. The invitation was a key, a chance to step through a forbidden door and see the man behind the myth. It was a challenge to the very foundations of her constrained existence. For the rest of the week, Beatrice was a ghost in her own home, her mind consumed by the impending rendezvous. On Friday evening, she pleaded a headache to excuse herself from a dinner party with the Hayes family, a lie that felt flimsy on her tongue, but bought her the time she needed. As the clock in the grand hall chimed the 11:15 to 11, she slipped out the servants' entrance, clad in a simple but elegant black dress that wouldn't draw attention, a dark woolen coat wrapped tightly around her. She felt like a spy in a foreign land, her pulse thrumming with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Just as the note promised, a black Duesenberg, long and sleek as a panther, was idling silently at the corner. Engine, a low, powerful rumble. The driver, the same young man who had delivered the note, stepped out and opened the rear door for her without a word. The interior was plush leather and polished wood. As she sank into the seat, she knew she had crossed a line from which there was no return. The car glided through the sleeping city, taking her not to the grand entrance of the Midnight Velvet, but to a discreet alleyway behind it. A steel door, unmarked and unassuming, was opened by a mountain of a man who simply nodded as she passed. Arthur Romano was waiting for her inside. The main club was dark and silent, the ghosts of jazz and laughter lingering in the air. He stood alone in the center of the vast, empty room, not in a tuxedo, but in tailored trousers and a white shirt, sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He looked less like a crime lord and more like a man at ease in his own kingdom after the courtiers had departed. "Miss Astor," he said, his voice a low resonance in the quiet space. "I'm glad you came." "Mr. Romano," she replied, her own voice steadier than she expected. "Your invitation was compelling." A faint smile touched his lips. "I find directness is often the most compelling approach. Please." He gestured, not towards the main stage, but to a smaller, more intimate room she hadn't noticed before, concealed behind a heavy velvet curtain. It was his private study. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled not with ledgers, but with leather-bound volumes of poetry, history, and philosophy. A grand fireplace crackled warmly, and two deep armchairs were angled towards it. On a low table between them sat a bottle of amber whiskey and two crystal glasses. The room smelled of old paper, wood smoke, and bourbon. It was a scholar's sanctuary, a stark contradiction to the violent gangster she had imagined. "You read," she stated, the words a soft exclamation of surprise. "Men in my position are often underestimated," he said, moving to pour two drinks. "It's one of my greatest advantages. People see the scar and the reputation, and they stop looking. They don't see the man." He handed her a glass. Whiskey. She hesitated, then accepted it. The illegal liquor was smooth and warm as it slid down her throat, a small act of defiance that emboldened her. "Why did you invite me here, Mr. Romano?" "Arthur," he corrected gently. "And I invited you, Beatrice, because you looked at me and saw something other than what you were supposed to see. First, a thug. Then, a kingpin. I am curious. I want to know what you see now." His directness was disarming. He was studying her with the same intensity she was studying him. The air between them crackled with unspoken questions. Before she could answer, the soft notes of a piano drifted from the corner of the room, where a young woman with soulful eyes sat at a baby grand. The singer. She began to hum a bluesy, melancholic melody, her voice rich and smoky, filling the room with a story of love and loss. Arthur didn't speak. He simply sank into the other armchair and listened, his gaze fixed on the fire. Beatrice watched his profile, the hard lines of his face softened by the flickering light. In the shared silence, punctuated only by the heartbreaking music, the roles they played in the outside world, judge's daughter, crime boss, began to dissolve. When the song ended, the silence that followed was profound. "She's magnificent," Beatrice whispered. "She has a gift," Arthur agreed. "Her husband was killed in a union dispute down at the docks. She has 2 children. Singing here gives her a way to provide for them, away from prying eyes and the charity of the church." He was revealing a piece of his world to her. Not the violence or the crime, but the ecosystem of loyalty and protection that existed under his rule. He was the patron, the provider, the unseen hand that balanced the scales in a city where justice was often for sale. "Is that what you do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Balance the scales." His dark eyes found hers. "Someone has to. The law your father upholds. It doesn't always protect the people who need it most. I offer a different kind of protection, a different kind of justice." He stood then and extended a hand to her. "Come." He led her out of the study and onto the empty dance floor of the club. "No band tonight," he said, a hint of a smile in his voice. "You'll have to make do with me." He pulled her gently into his arms, into a formal dance hold. There was no music, but he began to hum the melody the singer had just performed, his low baritone vibrating through his chest and into her. He moved with a surprising grace, leading her in slow, confident steps across the polished floor. Beatrice's mind went quiet. All that existed was the warmth of his hand on her back, the strength in his grip, the soft sound of his voice, and the rhythmic slide of their shoes on the wood. She rested her head against his shoulder, a gesture of surrender that felt both terrifying and inevitable. The scent of whiskey, clean soap, and something uniquely him filled her senses. This was a world of shadows and secrets, a world her father was sworn to destroy, and she was dancing in the very heart of it, held in the arms of its king. The attraction between them was no longer a spark, it was a slow-burning fire, deep and dangerous. In the silence of the empty speakeasy, a secret, impossible romance was being born. Their romance bloomed in the stolen hours, between midnight and dawn. It was a life lived in hushed tones and shadowed places, a world away from the sunlit scrutiny of Beatrice's society obligations. Arthur's Duesenberg would appear at a prearranged, discreet corner, and she would slip into its leather-scented darkness, leaving Beatrice Astor, the judge's daughter, behind. In his world, she was just Beatrice. He showed her a Chicago she never knew existed. They didn't frequent the grand ballrooms or the opera houses. Instead, he took her to smoky basement clubs where the jazz was more raw, more real. He led her through bustling night markets in immigrant neighborhoods where the air was rich with the smell of spices and roasted chestnuts, and no one gave them a second glance. They would end their nights in his study at the Midnight Velvet, talking for hours about the books they'd read, the dreams they'd once had, the futures they couldn't imagine. He was a revelation. She discovered a man with a keen intellect, a dry wit, and a surprising tenderness. He spoke of his childhood in the slums, not with self-pity, but with a pragmatist's acceptance. He explained the complex web of loyalties and codes that had governed his world, painting it not as a criminal enterprise, but as an alternate society, a kingdom for those the legitimate world had cast out. She was falling in love not with the dangerous Doan, but with Arthur, the man who read Keats and knew the name of every musician in his club. For Arthur, Beatrice was a breath of clean, fresh air in a life filled with smoke and blood. She saw past the formidable reputation to the man beneath. She wasn't afraid of his power, but she also wasn't seduced by it. She was captivated by his mind, his story. With her, he could lower his guard, shedding the heavy mantle of the Doan. In her presence, the constant threat of violence, the endless strategic maneuvering, seemed to recede. He was falling for her wit, her courage, and the defiant spark in her stormy grey eyes. He was falling in love with a woman who represented everything his life was sworn against. But their secret idol was a fragile bubble, and the outside world was a place of sharp objects. The lies began to pile up, each one a small but heavy stone on Beatrice's conscience. She invented sick friends, charity meetings that ran late, and a sudden passion for solitary, late-night reading to explain her absences. The deceit tasted like ash in her mouth, especially when she was with her father. One evening, at the Astors' formal dinner table, the conversation turned, as it often did, to the city's rampant crime. Judge Astor, a formidable man with a will of iron and a belief in the absolute righteousness of the law, sliced into his roast beef with controlled fury. "We had another bombing at a Northside distillery last night," he announced, his eyes sweeping the table. "Moran's crew, no doubt, trying to muscle in on new territory. But the real cancer, the one we must cut out, is the Romano organization. It's sophisticated, disciplined. That's what makes it so dangerous. This Arthur Romano is a ghost. By his influence is everywhere." Beatrice's fork clattered softly against her china plate. She felt the blood drain from her face. She kept her eyes fixed on her meal, praying no one would notice her reaction. To hear her father speak Arthur's name with such cold venom, to describe him as a cancer, it was a physical blow. "They say he runs that gaudy club, the Midnight Velvet," her mother Marian added with a delicate shudder. It's a disgrace that the police allow such a den of iniquity to operate so openly. We will shut him down, Judge Astor vowed, his voice ringing with conviction. I will not rest until men like Romano are behind bars or in the ground. They are a blight on this great city. Beatrice felt a knot of ice form in her stomach. She sat in silence, a traitor at her own family's table, trapped between the two powerful men who defined her life, her father, the crusader of justice, and her lover, the king of the underworld he was sworn to destroy. The weight of her secret felt immense, suffocating. Meanwhile, Arthur was fighting a war he desperately tried to keep from Beatrice's view. The peace in his kingdom was being challenged by a rival, a brutish gangster named Jack Mad Dog Moran, who preferred chaos to order. Moran's attacks were becoming more brazen, more violent, forcing Arthur's hand. One night, while Beatrice believed he was simply handling business, Arthur was in a warehouse by the docks, the air thick with the smell of stale whiskey and fear. He was not the calm, poetry-quoting man she knew. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes hard as flint. One of Moran's men was tied to a chair, bruised and bleeding. "Where is the next shipment coming in?" Arthur's voice was dangerously quiet, a tone that made his own men flinch. The man spat a bloody response. "Go to hell, Romano." Arthur didn't even blink. He gave a slight nod to his lieutenant, a grim-faced man named Roy. The sound that followed was brutal and final. Arthur turned away, his expression unreadable. This was the part of his life he shielded from her, the bloody price of his empire. Of the thought of Beatrice's gentle nature being exposed to this reality filled him with a fierce, protective instinct. He was living a lie just as profound as hers, pretending to be only the man she saw in the firelight of his study. The two worlds collided on a Tuesday morning. Beatrice was arranging flowers in the parlor when she saw the headline on the front page of the Chicago Tribune, left on the coffee table. "Warehouse war erupts. 3 dead in Southside shootout." Her blood ran cold. She snatched the paper, her hands trembling. The article described a brutal confrontation between rival bootlegging factions. It didn't name Arthur directly, but it referred to the powerful Romano syndicate and mentioned that the targeted warehouse was a known hub for his operations. It spoke of cold, efficient violence and a clear message being sent to his rivals. The words blurred before her eyes. 3 dead. This wasn't an abstract war her father spoke of. This was real. Men had died. And Arthur was at the center of it. The image of him humming softly as they danced, his hand gentle on her back, clashed violently with the image of a man who commanded this kind of bloodshed. That night, she had to see him. She sent a coded message through a trusted messenger and went to their meeting place, a small, quiet apartment Arthur kept above a bakery, a neutral ground that was neither his world nor hers. When he arrived, he saw the look on her face immediately. He knew. "You saw the papers," he stated. It wasn't a question. "Were you there?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Did you give the order?" Arthur's face was grim. He ran a hand over his jaw, the mask of the calm, collected tone firmly in place. "Beatrice, this is my world. It's not a clean one. Men like Moran, they don't understand negotiation. They only understand force. But people are dead, Arthur," she cried, the dam of her composure finally breaking. "They were killed. Is that the different kind of justice you told me about? Is this the man who reads Keats?" The accusation struck him harder than any bullet. He wanted to pull her into his arms, to lie, to tell her he had nothing to do with it, but he couldn't. He owed her a truth, even if it was a fractured one. "The man who reads Keats is the same man who must protect what is his," he said, his voice low and strained. "My people, my business. If I show weakness, Moran will slaughter us all. It is a war, and in war people die. I do what I must to keep the peace, even if it means violence." She stared at him, seeing for the first time not the charming enigma or the tender lover, but the ruthless pragmatist, the kingpin. The side of him she had conveniently ignored was now standing before her, stark and undeniable. The lies they had been telling themselves and each other were unraveling, and the raw, dangerous truth of their situation was laid bare. The beautiful, secret world they had built was standing on a foundation of blood and deceit, and, for the first time, Beatrice feared it was about to collapse. The chasm that had opened between them that night in the apartment did not close. It became a silent, watchful presence in their stolen moments together. Beatrice could no longer ignore the brutal reality of Arthur's life, and Arthur felt the weight of her silent judgment, a judgment he knew he deserved. He saw the flicker of fear in her eyes where once there had been only fascination. The easy intimacy they had shared was replaced by a taut, fragile tension. Love was still there, a deep and powerful current, but it was now tangled with doubt and fear. The world outside their bubble, however, was not content to wait for it to implode. It was coming for them with the force of a freight train. The catalyst was Stanley Hayes, spurned and suspicious. He had been using his family's resources to quietly investigate Beatrice's increasingly erratic behavior. His jealousy, disguised as concern, led him to hire a private detective, a weasel-faced man who was skilled at lingering in the shadows. It didn't take long for the detective to trace the discreet Black Duesenberg and connect it to the shadowy empire of Arthur Romano. When the detective presented his photographs, grainy, long-lens shots of Beatrice slipping into Arthur's car, of them sharing a quiet moment on a secluded park bench, Stanley's blood ran cold with a mixture of rage and vindictive opportunity. This was more than a simple dalliance. This was a scandal of catastrophic proportions. His fiancée was the city's most notorious racketeer. He knew exactly what to do with this information. It was the perfect weapon. He didn't go to Beatrice. He went to her father. Judge Walter Astor was in his mahogany-paneled study, reviewing case files, when Stanley was announced. The judge had a grudging respect for the young banker, seeing him as a sensible, if uninspired, match for his daughter. "Stanley," the judge said, looking up over his spectacles, "what brings you here at this hour?" Stanley's face was a mask of solemn concern. "Judge Astor, I come to you with the heaviest of hearts. This concerns Beatrice. I fear she is in a kind of trouble I cannot comprehend." He laid the envelope of photographs on the judge's immaculate desk. Silence descended upon the room as Judge Astor picked them up. He looked through them once, his expression unreadable. Then he went through them again, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the glossy prints. The color drained from his face, replaced by a deep, mottled red of pure fury. The images were undeniable. His daughter, his pristine, intelligent Beatrice, willingly, intimately, with the very man he had publicly declared a cancer on the city. The hypocrisy was a physical blow. The betrayal was a knife in his heart. When he finally spoke, his voice was terrifyingly calm. "Leave me," he said to Stanley, not looking up from the photos, "and do not speak a word of this to anyone. This will be handled within the family." When Beatrice returned home that evening, humming a tune she had heard at one of Arthur's clubs, she found her father waiting for her in the grand foyer. The air was frigid. He held the photographs in one hand. "Explain these," he said, his voice devoid of all warmth. Beatrice's world shattered. She looked at the damning images, at her own smiling face turned up toward Arthur's, and the lies she had so carefully constructed fell away, leaving her exposed and defenseless. There was nothing to say. "He's not what you think," she began, her voice a desperate whisper. "I know exactly what he is," her father roared, his composure finally snapping. "He is a thug, a murderer, a parasite who profits from the misery of others. And you have shamed this family in a way I never thought possible. You have spat on everything I stand for. I love him," she said, the words tasting of both defiance and despair. The judge flinched as if she had struck him. "Love? You call this sordid infatuation love? You have a choice, Beatrice, a final one. You will end this filth immediately. You will never see or speak to Arthur Romano again. You will announce your engagement to Stanley Hayes by the end of the week. Or you will be disowned. You will leave this house with nothing but the clothes on your back, and your name will never be spoken here again." He paused, his voice dropping to a cruel, calculated whisper. "And I will dedicate every resource I have, legal or otherwise, to ensuring your gangster lover spends the rest of his miserable life rotting in a cell." Tears streamed down Beatrice's face, but she held her father's merciless gaze. It was an impossible choice. Her family, her home, her entire past, or the man she loved, a man whose life was now in her hands. While Beatrice's world was imploding, Arthur was facing a threat of his own. Jack Moran, growing bolder, decided to strike not at Arthur's business, but at his heart. Moran had his own spies. He knew about the judge's daughter. He saw her not as a person, but as a lever, the perfect tool to break his rival. Arthur was in his office at the club when his lieutenant, Roy, burst in, his face pale. "Boss, we have a problem. Moran's crew. They've been seen casing the Astor residence." Arthur's blood turned to ice. He had been so careful to keep Beatrice shielded, to keep their worlds separate. But he had failed. He had brought the violence he commanded to her doorstep. The thought of Moran's brutish thugs laying a hand on her, of using her to get to him, filled him with a rage so profound it was almost blinding. She was his one vulnerability, his single catastrophic weakness, and his enemies had found it. He knew what he had to do. The choice was as clear and as painful as Beatrice's own. He sent her a one-line message, delivered by a different, unknown messenger. "Meet me, our place, midnight." When she arrived at the apartment above the bakery, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, her face etched with misery, she found him standing by the window, staring out at the city lights. He didn't turn to greet her. "It's over, Beatrice," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. It was a voice she didn't recognize. "What?" she whispered, her heart seizing. "Arthur, my father knows. He gave me an ultimatum. This has nothing to do with your father," he cut in, turning to face her. His expression was cold, shuttered. He had donned the mask of the Don, and it was impenetrable. "This was a mistake, a diversion. You and I, we're from different worlds. It was amusing for a while, but it's run its course." Every word was a calculated strike, designed to wound, to sever. He was trying to make her hate him. He needed her to hate him, to walk away, to be safe. It was the only way to protect her from Moran, to push her out of the line of fire he had so carelessly drawn around her. "You don't mean that," she said, taking a step toward him, her hand outstretched. "Arthur, look at me. I know you don't mean that. We can run away. We can leave Chicago. Don't be naive," he snapped, his voice lashing out like a whip. "Run away? To what? A life of looking over my shoulder? I am who I am, Beatrice. I run this city's underworld. Did you really think I would give that up for a society girl who was slumming it for a thrill?" The cruelty of his words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She staggered back, her hand falling to her side. The love and tenderness she had seen in his eyes were gone, replaced by a cold, dismissive glare. Was this the real him? Had she been a fool all along, a plaything for a powerful man? Her father's accusations, Arthur's own callous words, they all coalesced into a single, unbearable truth. It was over. "I see," she said, her voice a hollow shell. She pulled herself up, her Astor pride a final, flimsy piece of armor. "You are right. It was a mistake. She turned and walked to the door without looking back. Every step was agony. She had to believe him. If she let herself believe he was lying to protect her, she would never be able to leave. Arthur stood frozen, listening to her footsteps descending the stairs, listening to the front door open and close. The sound of her departure was the sound of his own heart being ripped from his chest. The moment she was gone, the mask shattered. He slammed his fist into the wall, a single guttural cry of anguish escaping his lips. He had saved her life, but he had just destroyed his own. They were both broken, both alone, separated by a wall of secrets and lies, victims of the very worlds they had tried so hard to escape. The weeks that followed were a grey, featureless expanse of misery for Beatrice. She moved through her life like an automaton, adhering to her father's commands with a chillingly placid obedience. She allowed her mother to plan an engagement party. She sat for fittings for a wedding dress she looked at with dead eyes. She smiled politely when Stanley Hayes kissed her hand, his touch feeling like ice on her skin. Her heartbreak was a cold, heavy stone in her chest, but beneath it, something else was beginning to smolder, a quiet, burning rage. Arthur's final words echoed in her mind, a society girl slumming it for a thrill. The insult was a festering wound. She had not been slumming. She had been in love, but had he? Or had she been, as her father and Stanley insisted, a naive fool? The doubt was torture, but it was the doubt that kept her from shattering completely. It fueled a need to understand, to uncover the truth behind their catastrophic end. Her opportunity came from an unlikely source. Stanley, puffed up with his victory, became careless in his gloating. During a cheerless dinner to celebrate their engagement, he drank too much champagne and spoke too freely of his triumph. "You see, my dear," he said, his words slightly slurred, "your father and I have handled the matter. The city will soon be rid of Romano's filth. The judge is coordinating with the Treasury Department on a major raid, and I provided the final piece of the puzzle." "What piece?" Beatrice asked, her voice flat, betraying no interest. "A little bird told me about a major shipment of Canadian whiskey Romano is expecting. The biggest of the year. It's the linchpin of his entire winter operation," Stanley preened. "But Moran's people have been tipped off. They plan to hit the warehouse first, cause a bloodbath. When the Prois arrive, they'll find Romano, his men, and a mountain of evidence. It will be a perfect storm. Moran gets the territory, your father gets his conviction, and I get you." He smiled, a smug, triumphant expression that made Beatrice's stomach turn. A cold dread washed over her, followed by a shocking, crystalline clarity. Moran's people have been tipped off. It wasn't just a raid, it was a setup, a trap designed to create a massacre and ensnare Arthur in it. And Stanley, her intended husband, was complicit. He wasn't just a banker, he was playing a dangerous game with the city's most violent criminals to settle a personal score. That night, Beatrice did something she never thought she would be capable of. She broke into her father's study. Fueled by a desperate, protective instinct, she searched his desk, her hands shaking. Tucked away in a locked drawer, she managed to pry open with a letter opener. She found it, a file. Inside were police reports, informant transcripts, and, most damningly, a detailed ledger. It wasn't a police ledger. The handwriting was Stanley's. It outlined payments made to a shell corporation that she quickly realized was a front for Jack Moran's gang. The truth was a sickening revelation. Stanley hadn't just tipped off Moran. He was financing him. He was using his banking expertise to launder money, helping Moran's operation in exchange for the intel that would destroy his rival, Arthur. Her fiancé was not just a snake. He was a traitor, playing both sides against the middle, allied with the very evil her father claimed to be fighting. And her father, blinded by his hatred for Arthur, was about to walk into a trap orchestrated by the man he wanted for a son-in-law. She had to warn Arthur, not just for his sake, but for her father's. A raid crashing into an active gang war would be a slaughterhouse. Policemen would die. Her father could be caught in the crossfire. With the ledger tucked inside her coat, she fled the house. She had no way to contact Arthur directly, no Duesenberg waiting at the corner. She did the only thing she could think of. She took a taxi to the alley behind the Midnight Velvet. It was well after closing time, the steel door ominously silent. She pounded on it, her fists aching, her voice hoarse as she shouted his name. Finally the door creaked open. The mountain of a man who served as his guard stared down at her. "He ain't here, and he ain't seeing visitors. Please," she begged, her voice breaking. "It's life or death. It's about the warehouse, the raid. Tell him Beatrice is here. He has to know it's a trap." The mention of the raid and her name was enough. The guard's eyes narrowed. He shut the door in her face, but she heard the sound of a telephone being dialed inside. Minutes later, which felt like an eternity, the door opened again. "Get in. A car's coming for you." She was driven, not to the familiar apartment, but to a sprawling, dark warehouse on the industrial edge of the city, the very place Stanley had mentioned. When she was ushered inside, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Men with grim faces and shotguns moved silently, fortifying positions behind crates of illicit liquor. In the center of it all stood Arthur. He was no longer the composed host or the tender lover. This was the Don in his element, a general on the eve of battle. His face was a hard mask, his eyes sharp and alert. When he saw her, his expression flickered with a mixture of shock, fury, and something she couldn't name. "What in God's name are you doing here?" he growled, striding toward her and grabbing her by the arms, his grip bruising. "I told you to stay away. This is the most dangerous place in the city for you to be right now." "Stanley is working with Moran," she said, ignoring his anger, shoving the ledger into his chest. "He's been financing him. He set this all up. He told Moran about your shipment to create a firefight, and he tipped off my father about the raid. He wants you all to kill each other so he can clean up the mess." Arthur snatched the ledger, his eyes scanning the pages. The cold fury on his face deepened into something lethal. The betrayal was absolute, the scope of the treachery breathtaking. He looked from the ledger back to her, his gaze searching her face. Why would you do this? Why come here?" "Because I never believed you," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Not for a second. I knew you were lying to protect me. And because my father is walking into that trap too. I love you, Arthur, but I won't let my father die for Stanley's ambition." The raw honesty of her confession shattered his composure. In that moment, surrounded by his soldiers and the scent of gunpowder, he let her see past the Don again. He saw not a society girl, but a woman of incredible courage, a woman who had risked everything to come to him. Suddenly, a screech of tires echoed from outside, followed by the splintering crack of automatic gunfire. "Moran's here," Roy yelled. "They're early." The battle had begun. Arthur shoved Beatrice behind a stack of heavy oak barrels. "Stay down. Do not move," he commanded, pulling a pistol from his waistband. The warehouse erupted into a deafening cacophony of bullets and shouting. Wood splintered, glass shattered. It was a vision from hell. Peeking through a gap, Beatrice saw Arthur moving with a deadly, fluid grace, directing his men, firing with calm precision. He was a creature of this violence, born to it. And yet, every few seconds, his eyes would dart back to her, ensuring she was safe. Then, a second sound joined the chaos, the shrill blast of police whistles from the other side of the warehouse. The raid had begun. Her father was here. Men were caught in a brutal three-way crossfire. Moran's thugs, Arthur's crew, and the police. It was the bloodbath Stanley had planned. Beatrice watched in horror as men on all sides fell. Through the smoke, she saw a clear threat. One of Moran's men had broken through the line and was taking aim at her father, who was crouched behind a police vehicle, directing his officers. Without thinking, Beatrice screamed, "Father! Look out!" The gunman turned, startled by her cry, and saw her. He grinned, a broken-toothed, vicious expression, and raised his weapon toward her. This was an easier, more valuable target. Time slowed. She saw the muzzle flash. She heard the deafening roar of the gun, but she felt no pain. Arthur stood in front of her, his body shielding hers. A dark red stain was spreading rapidly across the front of his white shirt. He staggered, but didn't fall, firing his own pistol twice. The gunman crumpled to the ground. "Arthur!" she screamed, catching him as his knees buckled. He collapsed against her, his weight immense. The battle still raged around them, a chaotic symphony of death, but their world had shrunk to this small, desperate space. Blood was on her hands, on her dress. His blood. He had taken a bullet meant for her. In the ultimate moment of decision, faced with a choice between his empire, his life, and his love, he had chosen her. And now, he was dying in her arms. The world exploded into a maelstrom of police whistles and organized chaos. The remaining thugs from Moran's crew, caught between Arthur's disciplined men and the sudden, overwhelming force of the law, were quickly subdued or cut down. The firefight, which had raged like a hellish storm, sputtered out into a tense, smoky silence, punctuated by the groans of the wounded. Beatrice was oblivious to it all. Her universe had collapsed to the space of the few feet where Arthur lay bleeding in her arms. "Help!" she screamed, her voice raw. "Somebody, help him!" A figure pushed through the smoke and knelt beside them. It was her father. Judge Astor's face was a mask of horror and disbelief. He stared at the man he had sworn to destroy, now lying critically wounded from a bullet that had been meant for his daughter. He saw the dark stains spreading across Arthur's chest, the blood on Beatrice's hands, and the sheer, unadulterated love and terror in her eyes. In that moment, Arthur Romano was not a gangster. He was the man who had saved his child's life. "Get a medic," the judge bellowed, his voice cracking with an authority born of desperation. The hours that followed were a blur of ambulance sirens, sterile white corridors, and the antiseptic smell of a hospital. Beatrice refused to leave Arthur's side until he was taken into surgery, her black dress stained and torn, a stark contrast to the clean, cold environment. Her father stood by her, a silent, grim statue. The fury had drained out of him, leaving behind a hollowed-out confusion. In the stark quiet of the waiting room, Beatrice finally handed him the ledger. "This is why," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "This is what Stanley did. He used you. He used all of us." The judge read through the pages under the harsh, fluorescent light. Each entry, each meticulously recorded payment to Moran's front, was a nail in the coffin of his certainty. He had been a pawn, his crusade for justice manipulated by a venal boy's jealousy. His righteous war was a sham, orchestrated to settle a romantic rivalry. The humiliation was a bitter pill, but it was overshadowed by a chilling realization. He had almost led his own daughter, and the man who had just saved her, to their deaths based on a lie. Arthur survived the surgery. The bullet had missed his heart by a fraction of an inch. He lay in a private room, a policeman stationed outside his door, a prisoner in the hospital bed. When Beatrice was finally allowed to see him, she found him pale and weak, but his dark eyes were clear, and they were fixed on her. "You're a fool, Beatrice Astor," he whispered, his voice raspy. "The bravest, most beautiful fool I have ever known, and you were a terrible liar." "Arthur Romano," she replied, tears tracing paths down her dusty cheeks as she gently took his hand. Her father entered the room a day later. He and Arthur looked at each other for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement passing between two kings of different, warring kingdoms. There was no friendship, no forgiveness, but a new, grudging respect. "The ledger you provided," the judge said, his voice formal, "has led to a warrant for the arrest of Stanley Hayes. His assets have been frozen. His name is ruined." He paused. "Moran was found dead in a back alley this morning. It seems that, with their funding cut, his crew turned on him." Arthur simply nodded, a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. His own men, loyal and efficient, had cleaned up the last loose end. "And what of you, Mr. Romano?" the judge asked. "You were found at the scene of a crime, surrounded by illegal liquor and wounded in a gangland shootout. I have every reason to keep you locked away for the rest of your life, but you won't," Arthur stated. "Not a question, but a fact. Because you are a man of honor, Judge, and you know I am not the man you thought I was." It was a gamble, a test of the judge's newfound perspective. The judge was silent for a long time. "There will be an arrangement," he said finally. "The city needs order more than it needs another dead crime lord. Your testimonia, anonymously of course, will help us clean up the corruption Stanley exposed in our own ranks. In return, your operations will face a certain lack of scrutiny, so long as they remain quiet, so long as the bodies stop falling." It was a truce, an unholy alliance between the law and the lawless, born from a shared moment of violent truth. 6 months later, the snows of winter had melted, and a tentative spring was blooming in Chicago. The city was still a place of secrets and jazz, but the open warfare was over. Stanley Hayes was awaiting trial, his reputation and family fortune in tatters. With Moran gone, Arthur had consolidated his power, but, as promised, he had changed. He steered his empire away from the brutal violence of territorial disputes and deeper into the more legitimate world of entertainment, the clubs, the music, the clandestine supply of liquor to an elite clientele who were happy to look the other way. He was still the Don, but he was becoming a businessman, a patron of the arts, a king who now preferred to rule from a velvet throne rather than a bloody one. Beatrice stood with him on the balcony of his new penthouse apartment, a respectable address that overlooked the shimmering waters of Lake Michigan. The faint scar on his eyebrow, and a newer, deeper one on his chest, hidden beneath a fine silk shirt, were the only visible reminders of the night that had changed everything. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her engagement ring from Stanley long since discarded at the bottom of the Chicago River. "My father asked about you today," she said softly. "I think it was his way of giving his blessing." Arthur smiled, a genuine, easy smile she had come to cherish. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "He's a good man. He just sees the world in black and white." "And us?" she asked, looking up at him. "What do we see?" He looked out over the sprawling city below, a city of dazzling lights and deep shadows, of grand cathedrals and hidden alleys. "Their city. We see the gray," he said, his voice a low, confident rumble. "We see it all, and we see it together." They were two souls from opposite worlds, forged into one by a love that had defied convention, survived betrayal, and been baptized in fire. Their future would never be simple, and the shadows of their past would always linger. But as they stood there, watching the last rays of sunlight paint the sky, they were not afraid. They had found their own kind of justice, their own kind of peace, a new dawn rising from the heart of the roaring 20s. The true measure of a person is not found in their reputation, their wealth, or the station they were born into, but in the choices they make when faced with the crucible of love and sacrifice. True love is the courage to look past the world's labels and see the soul within. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more romances.